Hello and welcome as we come to the 22nd Sunday of the year. The scripture readings that we're looking at this time, the first reading comes from the book of Sirach, chapter 3, verses 17 through and 18, verses 20, verses 28 through 29. The second reading from the letter to the Hebrews, chapter 12, verses 18 and 19, verses 22 through 24a. I do a little skipping around here as you notice. And the gospel comes from Luke chapter 14, verse 1, and then verses 7 through 14. So this time let's quickly look at the 14th chapter of Luke's story. Remember, Jesus again is on the journey to Jerusalem, and a number of these stories are inserted as Luke sees Jesus making this trip. Chapter 14 might be divided into 4 sections. Let me give you the verses, and we'll talk a little bit about some of them. Verse 1 through 6 describes Jesus healing a man with dropsy. And then verses 7 through 10 talk about places at table. Verses 12 through 14 is addressed to the host and what guests he should invite. And then verses 15 through 24 are another parable about the great feast. So just to give a little background as we are looking at these episodes in Luke's story, as chapter 14 begins, Jesus heals a man with dropsy, and the question will arise as whether it is lawful for Jesus to be healing on the Sabbath. Once again, as we have noticed in this story, the Pharisees are always there, kind of looking to see whether or not they can find some way to discredit Jesus for actions that he is doing. Again, a caution that the Pharisees here that are mentioned in Luke's story are the Pharisees that his community in the 80s was dealing with. And we have to be very careful that we don't judge the Pharisees of Jesus' time in the same way, because at that point in time, the Pharisees, you remember, were simply one group of many who were helping to guide the Israelites with their practice and their belief. We know some of them who are current and active in Jesus' time thanks to the Gospels, and we have mentioned them on occasion previously. Certainly you had the Pharisees, you had the Sadducees, who were simply kind of the priests in charge of what went on up at the temple area. You had the Zealots, who of course were probably not yet an organized party in Jesus' time. Zealots, of course, were those who thought that there was only really one way to restore kind of peace and justice in Israel, and that was to drive out the Roman presence. Now, that, of course, was not the situation in Jesus' time, and so we're not quite sure just how organized the Zealot movement was. It became more organized in the 40s and 50s, but keep in mind that this was after Jesus' time. You also had the Essenes, who were down at the Dead Sea. They had their own viewpoint of Jewish life and how things should have been done. So again, point being, in Jesus' time, there were numerous groups. No one was really in charge of Jewish thought completely. But by the time of Luke, the Pharisees have emerged as the leading group. The others have all really, for all intent and purposes, you remember, gone out of existence with the fall of Jerusalem in the year 70. So here are the Pharisees now concerned that Jesus heals a man on the Sabbath. Is it right for him to do this? And so We start off with one of these antagonistic stories where Jesus has healed. The authorities are questioning whether that breaks the Sabbath law. What's the Sabbath law? Well, you should rest on the Sabbath, and that therefore healing a man was a work, it should not be done. Jesus, of course, and many who read this kind of smile at this, but that's the situation that begins chapter 14 this time. We will not be hearing this in any of our readings, so I do fill in. And Jesus, of course, says, well, a man has suffered so long, should he have to suffer more simply because of the Sabbath? And also it was known that works of healing were not disabled on, kind of play with that word, on the Sabbath day. All right, verses 7 through 10 deal with places at table. Now, a little bit of background here about the whole idea of meals in the Roman world, in the first century world. Most meals were attended by people of the same social class. So the fact, by the way, as this episode begins, that the Pharisees accept Jesus to come to a meal at his house indicate that they accepted him as a social equal. And the fact now that they are watching, and the word here, watching, quote unquote, tends to have an hostile attitude toward it. It looks again as if they are looking for a way to catch Jesus in some shortcoming of some kind. Unfortunately, that's the way in which the Pharisees, as we have noted, are being interpreted and described in much of Luke's story. There is one or two occasions when one of the Pharisees warns Jesus that the authorities are after him, but that really doesn't give the whole picture here of the attitude, as we mentioned, of the Pharisees. All right, so what is the issue here that goes on at these meals? Well, what is important here is the behavior of those who are at these meals. And here are some of the things that therefore become very important. Now, they would not be important, perhaps, we in the Western or the American tradition, but they were important in the first century Mediterranean world. They would watch which ones washed their hands, remember? And the washing of hands here is not a sanitary kind of thing, as you and I were brought up by your parents, wash your hands before you eat. That wasn't really the way in which washing was understood. It was a ritual that before you entered into a meal, there was washing of hands. So who washed their hands? Then they were noticed who eats what, when, where, what is done or omitted when people are called to the table. Who are those who are invited? Where do people sit? With whom does one eat? So in other words, not only where do you sit, but who's to your right and who's to your left. In what order persons of different rank are placed at the table. So all of those would be kind of questions that people would look at or be concerned with if they were invited to a meal, or here in this case you could say a banquet, but and we might pay some attention to those questions, but not perhaps as much. And then, of course, it was important, as we notice the social setting here for this, that one stayed one step behind, because honor was, of course, a very issue. Always honor, we have noticed this before. who are those who have been invited by the host, and are those who have been invited more important than one who is also invited? And so in that sense, one needed to step one or keep one step behind the honored one who was invited. And Jesus' advice here, as you remember, is when you are invited to a banquet, take a seat at the lower end so that then the one who invites you can say, "Friend, come up higher." See, and so it's better in that sense to start at the bottom and to be brought up higher than to be up now what does higher mean? Closer to the guest and who the host had invited, and closer to the host himself. And so the tables were somewhat what we would perhaps describe as U-shaped, so that the host and guest sat at the top of the U, and then the others on both sides. So it wouldn't have been necessarily one long table, as sometimes we might think of it, but with the U, then people were able to, look at one another across the table. So here's the background for this. Accepting an invitation, by the way, to dinner in the ancient Mediterranean world obligated the guest to return the favor. So that was another kind of thing. If you invited someone to a banquet and you accepted, then you in turn were expected to invite that person back again. So it's the principle, we've mentioned this, of reciprocity. The key factor in this regard was to keep economic equals together, okay? Now, Jesus' advice here, so all of that you kind of get is the kind of setting for this particular episode. Certainly it is interesting, as I mentioned, that Jesus was invited and that he accepted the invitation. Eating together indicates a sharing of common ideals and values. So we know from Roman sources, and so a little bit of history, that when we talk, and we're talking all about these meals and who eats and who sets and is setting and all of that, it may not be, as I say, all important to us, but it was to them. The Roman sources about meals tell us that guests of differing social ranks are seated, according to the Roman writing, in separate rooms, so that those who were important would not be eating with those who were not so important. And in fact, that those who sat and ate were seated in a special room, were also given different food and wine. The idea is they got something better than others. Now, again, this is a whole kind of background about meals, and we have a couple of Pliny, the writer, describes the Roman values here, or customs, about who should be invited to these meals and where they should be seated. Now, I don't think that's the case in the gospel we hear, but I did want to remind us that Luke is writing at a time in which the Roman government has taken over the Mediterranean area. He is certainly aware of the fact that a number of those who are embracing the teaching of Jesus were non-Jewish, who were Gentiles, so they would have been aware of the customs of the time and how they worked. Now, this is where Jesus' advice, and here's where the gospel we pick up again, to the host is not only rude, but insulting, shocking, Jesus kind of is pictured as challenging them. When you, and some have said that what Jesus was doing was cultured suicide. Well, I don't think that happened here. But they were setting a trap for Jesus, and now they are going to be trapped by Jesus, whose teaching, as always, turns the world upside down. So what does Jesus say here? Look, when you invite people who are not ordinarily invited. And when you come to a table like this, sit at the lower section so that you can be, when the host chooses, calling you up. Therefore, you will be honored, because if you are taking a position up close to the host and he says, well, look, I got to bring other people up here, you will be placed in a position of shame. So once again, we have this whole issue of honor and shame. We've noticed this on a number of occasions. Here, once again, this is at play in this situation. So Jesus is encouraging the host to invite not just those of social equality, but also to invite others who were not in the same rank and position as they were. Perhaps who kind of develops this earlier on is in his letter, Paul's, to the Corinthians. And in one case, he is quite disturbed by the fact that those who are well-to-do, those who are socially honored, meet, first of all, on the day in which the Eucharist is celebrated by Christian believers. Now, again, this is Paul's take in the first letter to the Corinthians. Apparently, Eucharists were celebrated in the evening, unlike today, where many of our traditional Masses or Eucharists are celebrated in the morning. I know we have vigils, but that still looks toward the morning celebration. But in apparently Paul's time, particularly in the city of Corinth, meals were Eucharist were celebrated with a meal preceding the celebration of the Eucharist. So Paul's kind of objection here is that those who are well off, the wealthy, gather early. Now, we don't have a time frame here by the clock, but they gather early, and that by the time that the ordinary person who has been out working for the day and who now comes for the celebration of the Eucharist arrive, that the food and the drink is gone, or what is remaining is very poor, okay? And Paul is disturbed by this. He's angry about the fact that those who are well off take advantage in a certain way of those who are not, because by the time that those who are not arrive, they kind of get the scraps of what is taking place. So here in Paul's work, and I mention this because the first letter to the Corinthians is generally believed to be penned sometime in the early 50s of the common time, so therefore before the time that Luke writes his story here, that again there is this struggle between social rank among those who are believers. You see, believers may have come from the ordinary social classes. The meal that they are gathering to celebrate, that would be what we would call the Eucharist, brings together those of various social classes. This would be challenging for the first century world, for its cultural understandings. And so Paul, now you remember his advice in the letter to the Corinthians is, look, if we're going to eat a meal, then eat it at home before we come to the Eucharist. So his idea was, let us gather for the Eucharistic celebration, for the breaking of bread at the table of the Lord that joins us together in the risen Jesus. Let us do that together, but let it not be preceded by meals which separate, where the poor have to eat certain things, the rich other. And that may well be why eating before the Eucharist or reading before Mass had its origin already, so that the point that we are making here is this struggle that goes on very early on between the different social ranks of those who became believers. Jesus' practice of seeking out the most marginal and inviting them to the table is what is important here. Jesus' advice, now remember and this is where, by the way, verse 11, which is what is known as a free-floating proverb. It is unique to Luke's story. It reads this way: "For everyone self-exalting will be humbled, and everyone self-humbling will be exalted." And so we've heard that whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted, is kind of interjected here in this little story that we are hearing, this little parable this time. Verses now 12 and 14, as we move on through this section, is advice given to the host. All right, and as we have mentioned really already in our discussions today, the host is told, next time you have a meal like this, invite those who you wouldn't ordinarily invite. Invite the socially, less, the poor, the crippled, the handicapped. Remember, all of them were considered to, it wasn't based on the terminology that we do, were considered to be outcasts, and therefore probably never even got invited to dinners like this. So Jesus is saying, look, you invite all the socially nice people here, and I'm delighted to be here, but next time invite those who are not so socially well established in society. A typical, remember, quality of the Lucan story, which tends to inverse things. We've seen a number of occasions in Luke's story where the tables, if you want, are turned. So if you have the rich on top and the poor here, let's turn it around and have the poor there and the rich there. We have seen this already, for example, in the hymn given to Mary in the opening chapter of Luke's Gospel, the so-called Magnificat. But in many other ways throughout the Lucan story, this idea of reversal takes place. As we have pointed out, the poor are considered to be the crippled, the lame, the blind. It's all right, says the social group of the time, to let this group be objects of charity, but they are not to be dinner guests, okay? So you can feel sorry for the poor, keep them outside there, take maybe occasionally opportunities to take care of them, but don't invite them to the table. Why? Because they were considered to be, and here again, remember the Pharisees are watching and listening to this little section of Luke's story, considered to be impure. And so, and again, impurity has to do with the fact that they don't go through the normal customs that are important when the Hebrews gather to pray, or certainly gather for celebration, namely, as we mentioned at the beginning, the washing of hands. May not be important for us, but apparently what was important in the Jewish culture that had developed around the time in which this gospel was written. All right, so I think you have to wonder, when Jesus accepted this invitation, knowing the custom that if you accept the invitation to someone, then you in turn are asked to invite the host back again. Now, this would be really consistent with what Jesus is doing here, because what Jesus will do is invite everyone to share in the kingdom of God, at the table of the Lord, at the banquet of goodness. So this will not be simply something that the socially accepted, whatever class they in Jewish and Gentile society they happen to belong to, but everyone would be invited. And so you have here sort of the universal acceptance of every, or should have the universal acceptance of everyone. So well, we've talked today a lot about meals, settings, places like that. Might be interesting when we think of who do we invite to dinners, who do we invite to lunch sometimes. The situation may not be so different than perhaps it was in the days of Jesus, or in the days of Luke. So whether or not, now we'll kind of conclude quickly today in this, that those who are honored should precede those who are not honored. Looks like in the royalty, it works the other way around, that the less important, the fewer who are of noble rank go first, and that the honored one comes last. So really, Roman culture would change the approach to things, where in Jesus' time, the honored went first and the others followed behind. Here, those who are not so important go first, and the honored comes last. And I suppose from a Roman point of view, that made some sense, because the praise and honor was given to the last person there, rather than given right away, and then the rest were kind of not looked at all. So this little chapter, therefore, again challenges the Pharisees to be like Jesus, accepting of all, regardless of rank or position in the social life of the Mediterranean world. If today most meals are, that is, our Eucharistic celebration hopefully invites and includes everyone into the celebration. May we not be responsible for causing some to stand outside the community, but invite them in. And so in answering some of the questions, where are we seated when we gather at the Eucharistic table? Do we have certain seats that are not assigned to us, but that we take, and that therefore it is our seat and nobody else should take it? Isn't that interesting, sometimes, how that works? I know none of you would ever do that, and if someone wanted to get in your seat, you would move on. Be that's kind of just anecdotal here to the question that we're looking at this time. Thank you for being with us. Hope to see you again.